Volume 4, Chapter 1 of Clayhanger, by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1. His Start in Life. The Birthday Visit. It was Auntie Hamps's birthday. "She must be quite 59," said Maggie. "Oh, stuff!" Edwin contradicted her curtly. "She can't be anything like as much as that." Having, by this positive and sharp statement, disposed of the question of Mrs Hamps's age, he bent again with eagerness to his newspaper. The Manchester Examiner no longer existing as a Radical organ, he read the Manchester Guardian, of which that morning's issue contained a long and vivid obituary of Charles Stewart Parnell. Brother and sister were at breakfast. Edwin had changed the character of this meal. He went fasting to business at 8 o'clock, opened correspondence, and gave orders to the wonderful Stifford, a person now of real importance in the firm, and at 9 o'clock flew by car back to the house to eat bacon and eggs and marmalade leisurely, like a gentleman. It was known that between 9 and 10 he could not be seen at the shop. "Well," Maggie continued, with her mild persistence, "Aunt Spencer told me " "Who's Aunt Spencer, in God's name?" "You know, mother's and auntie's cousin. The fat old thing." "Oh, her!" He recalled one of the unfamiliar figures that had bent over his father's coffin. "She told me auntie was either 55 or 56 at father's funeral. And that's nearly 3½ years ago. So she must be " "2½ you mean," Edwin interrupted, with a sort of savageness. "No, I don't. It's nearly 3 years since Mrs Nixon died." Edwin was startled to realise the passage of time. But he said nothing. Partly he wanted to read in peace, and partly he did not want to admit his mistake. Bit by bit he was assuming the historic privileges of the English master of the house. He had the illusion that if only he could maintain a silence sufficiently august, his error of fact and of manner would cease to be an error. "Yes, she must be 59," Maggie resumed placidly. "I don't care if she's 159," snapped Edwin. "Any more coffee? Hot, that is." Without moving his gaze from the paper, he pushed his cup a little way across the table. Maggie took it, her chin slightly lifting and her cheeks showing a touch of red. "I hope you didn't forget to order the inkstand, after all," she said stiffly. "It's not been sent up yet, and I want to take it down to auntie's myself this morning. You know what a lot she thinks of such things." It had been arranged that Auntie Hamps should receive that year a cut glass double inkstand from her nephew and niece. The shop occasionally dealt in such articles. Edwin had not willingly assented to the choice. He considered that a cut glass double inkstand was a vicious concession to Mrs Hamps's very vulgar taste in knick knacks, and moreover he always now discouraged retail trade at the shop. But still he had assented out of indolence. "Well, it won't come till to morrow," he said. "But, Edwin, how's that?" "How's that? Well, if you want to know, I didn't order it till yesterday. I can't think of everything." "It's very annoying," said Maggie sincerely. Edwin put on the martyr's crown. "Some people seem to think I've nothing else to do down at my shop but order birthday presents," he remarked, with disagreeable sarcasm. "I think you might be a little more polite," said Maggie. "Do you?" "Yes, I do," Maggie insisted stoutly. "Sometimes you get positively unbearable. Everybody notices it." "Who's everybody?" "You never mind." TWO. Maggie tossed her head, and Edwin knew that when she tossed her head, a gesture rare with her, she was tossing the tears back from her eyes. He was more than startled, he was intimidated, by that feminine movement of the head. She was hurt. It was absurd of her to be so susceptible. But he had undoubtedly hurt her. He had been clumsy enough to hurt her. She was nearing 40, and he also was close behind her on the road to 40. She was a perfectly decent sort, and he reckoned that he too was a perfectly decent sort. And yet they lacked the skill not to bicker. They no longer had the somewhat noisy altercations of old days concerning real or fancied interferences with the order and privacy of Edwin's sacred chamber, but their general demeanour to one another had duly soured. It was as if they tolerated one another from motives of self-interest. Why should this be so? They were at bottom affectionate and mutually respectful. In a crisis they could and would rely on one another utterly. Why should their demeanour be so false an index to their real feelings? He supposed it was just the fault of loose habit. He did not blame her. From mere pride he blamed himself. He knew himself to be cleverer, more perceptive, wilier than she, and he ought to have been able to muster the diplomatic skill necessary for smooth and felicitous intercourse. Any friction, whether due to her stupidity or not, was a proof of his incompetence in the art of life. Everybody notices it. The phrase pricked him. An exaggeration, of course. Still, a phrase that would not be dismissed by a superior curl of the lips. Maggie was not Clara, and she did not invent allegations. His fault. Yes, his fault. Beyond doubt he was occasionally gruff, he was churlish, he was porcupinish. He did not mean to be so, indeed he most honestly meant not to be so, but he was. He must change. He must turn over a new leaf. He wished it had been his own birthday, or better still, the New Year, instead of his auntie's birthday, so that he might have turned over a new leaf at once with due solemnity. He actually remembered a pious saw uttered over 20 years earlier by that wretch in a white tie who had damnably devised the Sunday afternoon Bible class, a saw which he furiously scorned. Every day begins a new year. Well, every day did begin a new year. So did every minute. Why not begin a new year then, in that minute? He had only to say in a cajoling, good-natured tone, "All right, all right! Keep your hair on, my child. I grovel." He had only to say some such words, and the excellent, simple, unresentful Maggie would at once be appeased. It would be a demonstration of his moral strength to say them. But he could not say them. THREE. Nevertheless he did seriously determine to turn over a new leaf at the very next occasion. His eyes were now following the obituary of Parnell mechanically, without transmitting any message that his preoccupied brain would seize. He had been astonished to find that Parnell was only 45. He thought: why, at my age Parnell was famous, a great man, and a power. And there was he, Edwin, eating bacon and eggs opposite his sister in the humdrum dining room at Bleakridge. But after all, what was the matter with the dining room? It was not the dining room that his father had left. He had altered and improved it to suit his own taste. He was free to do so, and he had done so. He was free in every way. The division of his father's estate, according to the will, had proved unjust to himself, but he had not cared in the least. He had let Albert do as Albert and Clara pleased. In the settlement Maggie had taken the house at a figure too high, and he paid her an adequate rent for it, while she in turn paid him for her board and lodging. They were all in clover, thanks to the terrible lifelong obstinacy of the little boy from the Bastille. And Edwin had had the business unburdened. It was not growing, but it brought in more than twice as much as he spent. Soon he would be as rich as either of the girls, and that without undue servitude. He bought books surpassing those books of Tom Orgreave which had once seemed so hopelessly beyond his reach. He went to the theatre. He went to concerts. He took holidays. He had been to London, and more than once. He had a few good friends. He was his own master. Nobody dreamed of saying him nay, and no bad habits held him in subjection. Everywhere he was treated with quite notable respect. Even when, partly from negligence, and partly to hide recurring pimples, he had allowed his beard to grow, Clara herself had not dared to titter. And although he suffered from certain disorders of the blood due to lack of exercise and to his condition, his health could not be called bad. The frequency of his colds had somewhat diminished. His career, which to others probably seemed dull and monotonous, presented itself to him as almost miraculously romantic in its development. And withal he could uneasily ask himself, "Am I happy?" Maggie did not guess that as he bent unseeing over his precious Manchester Guardian, he was thinking: "I must hold an inquisition upon my whole way of existence. I must see where I stand. If ever I am to be alive, I ought to be alive now. And I'm not at all sure whether I am." Maggie never put such questions to herself. She went on in placidness, from hour to hour, ruffled occasionally. FOUR. An unusual occurrence gave him the opportunity to turn over a new leaf immediately. The sounds of the front door bell and of voices in the hall were followed by the proud entrance of Auntie Hamps herself into the dining room. "Now don't disturb yourselves, please," Mrs Hamps entreated. She often began with this phrase. Maggie sprang up and kissed her, somewhat effusively for Maggie, and said in a quiet, restrained tone, "Many happy returns of the day, auntie." Then Edwin rose, scraping his arm-chair backwards along the floor, and shook hands with her, and said, with a guilty grin, "A long life and a merry one, auntie." "Eh!" she exclaimed, falling back with a sigh of satisfaction into a chair by the table. "I'm sure everybody's very kind." "Will you believe me, those darling children of Clara's were round at my house before 8 o'clock this morning." "Is Amy's cough better?" Maggie interjected, as she and Edwin sat down. "Bless ye!" cried Auntie Hamps. "I was in such a fluster I forgot to ask the little toddler. But I didn't hear her cough. I do hope it is. October's a bad time for coughs to begin. I ought to have asked. But I'm getting an old woman." "We were just arguing whether you were 38 or 39, auntie," said Edwin. "What a tease he is, with his beard!" she archly retorted. "Well, your old aunt is 60 this day." "60!" the nephew and niece repeated together in astonishment. Auntie Hamps nodded. "You're the finest 60 I ever saw," said Edwin, with unaffected admiration. And she was fine. The pride in her eye as she made the avowal, probably the first frank avowal of her age that had passed those lips for 30 years, was richly justified. With her clear rosy complexion, her white regular teeth, her straight spine, her plump figure, her brilliant gaze, her rapid gestures, and that authentic hair of hers falling in Victorian curls, she offered to the world a figure that no one could regard without a physical pleasure and stimulation. And she was so shiningly correct in her black silk and black velvet, and in the massive jet at her throat, and in the slenderness of her shoe. It was useless to recall her duplicities, her mendacities, her hypocrisies, her meannesses. At any rate, she could be generous at moments, and the splendour of her vitality, sometimes as now, hid all her faults. She would confess to aches and pains like other folk, bouts of rheumatism, for example, but the high courage of her body would not deign to ratify such miserable statements. It haughtily repelled the touch of time. It kept at least the appearance of victory. If you did not like Auntie Hamps willingly, in her hours of bodily triumph you had to like her unwillingly. Both Edwin and Maggie had innumerable grievances against her, but she held their allegiance, and even their warm instinctive affection, on the morning of her 60th birthday. She had been a lone widow ever since Edwin could remember, and yet she had continued to bloom. Nothing could desiccate nor wither her. Even her sins did not find her out. God and she remained always on the best terms, and she thrived on insincerity. FIve. "There's a little parcel for you, auntie," said Edwin, with a particular effort to make his voice soft and agreeable. "But it's in Manchester. It won't be here till to morrow. My fault entirely. You know how awful I am for putting off things." "We quite expected it would be here to day," said the loyal Maggie, when most sisters, and Clara assuredly, would have said in an eager sarcastic tone, "Yes, it's just like Edwin, and yet I reminded him I don't know how many times." Edwin felt with satisfaction that the new leaf was already turned. He was glad that he had said "my fault entirely." He now said to himself: "Maggie's all right, and so am I. I must keep this up. Perfect nonsense, people hinting that she and I can't get on together." "Please, please," Auntie Hamps entreated, "don't talk about parcels." And yet they knew if they had not talked about a parcel the ageing lady would have been seriously wounded. "All I want is your love. You children are all I have now. And if you knew how proud I am of you all, seeing you all so nice and good and respected in the town, and Clara's little darlings beginning to run about, and such strong little things. If only your poor mother..." Impossible not to be impressed by those accents. Edwin and Maggie might writhe under Auntie Hamps's phraseology. They might remember the most horrible examples of her cant. In vain. They were impressed. They had to say to themselves: "There's something very decent about her, after all." Auntie Hamps looked from one to the other, and at the quiet opulence of the breakfast table, and the spacious solidities of the room. Admiration and respect were in that eye, always too masculine to weep under emotion. Undoubtedly she was proud of her nephew and nieces. And had she not the right to be? The bearded Edwin, one of the chief tradesmen in the town, and so fond of books, such a reader, and so quiet in his habits! And the two girls with nice independent fortunes! Clara so fruitful and so winning, and Maggie so dependable, so kind! Auntie Hamps had scarce anything else to wish for. Her ideals were fulfilled. Undoubtedly, since the death of Darius, her attitude towards his children had acquired even a certain humility. "Shall you be in to morrow morning, auntie?" Maggie asked, in the constrained silence that followed Mrs Hamps's protestations. "Yes, I shall," said Mrs Hamps, with assurance. "I shall be mending curtains." "Well, then, I shall call. About 11." Maggie turned to Edwin benevolently. "It won't be too soon if I pop in at the shop a little before 11?" "No," said Edwin, with equal benevolence. "It's not often Sutton's delivery is after 10. That'll be all right. I'll have it unpacked." SIX. He lit a cigarette. "Have one?" he suggested to Mrs Hamps, holding out the case. "I shall give you a rap over the knuckles in a minute," smiled Mrs Hamps, who was now leaning an elbow on the table in easy intimacy. And she went on in a peculiar tone, low, mysterious, and yet full of vivacity: "I can't quite make out who that little nephew is that Janet Orgreave is taking about." "Little nephew that Janet's taking about?" murmured Maggie in surprise. And to Edwin: "Do you know?" Edwin shook his head. "When?" he asked. "Well, this morning," said Mrs Hamps. "I met them as I was coming up. She was on one side of the road and the child was on the other, just opposite Howson's. My belief is she'd lost all control over the little jockey. Oh, a regular little jockey! You could see that at once. `Now, George, come along,' she called to him. And then he shouted, `I want you to come on this side, auntie.' Of course I couldn't stop to see it out. She was so busy with him she only just moved to me." George? George? Maggie consulted her memory. How old was he about? 7 or 8, I should say. Well, it couldn't be one of Tom's children, nor Alicia's. "No," said Auntie Hamps. "And I always understood that the eldest daughter's what's her name? Marion's were all girls. I believe they are, aren't they, Edwin?" "How can I tell?" said Edwin. It was a marvel to him how his auntie collected her information. Neither she nor Clara had ever been in the slightest degree familiar with the Orgreaves, and Maggie, so far as he knew, was not a gossiper. He thought he perceived, however, the explanation of Mrs Hamps's visit. She had encountered in the street a phenomenon which would not harmonise with facts of her own knowledge, and the discrepancy had disturbed her to such an extent that she had been obliged to call in search of relief. There was that, and there was also her natural inclination to show herself off on her triumphant 60th birthday. "Charles Orgreave isn't married, is he?" she inquired. "No," said Maggie. SEVEN. Silence fell upon this enigma of Janet's entirely unaccountable nephew. "Charlie may be married," said Edwin humorously at length. "You never know. It's a funny world. I suppose you've seen," he looked particularly at his auntie, "that your friend Parnell's dead?" She affected to be outraged. "I've seen that Parnell is dead," she rebuked him, with solemn quietness. "I saw it on a poster as I came up. I don't want to be uncharitable, but it was the best thing he could do. I do hope we've heard the last of all this Home Rule now." Like many people, Mrs Hamps was apparently convinced that the explanation of Parnell's scandalous fall and of his early death was to be found in the inherent viciousness of the Home Rule cause, and also that the circumstances of his end were a proof that Home Rule was cursed of God. She reasoned with equal power forwards and backwards. And she was so earnest and so dignified that Edwin was sneaped into silence. Once more he could not keep from his face a look that seemed to apologise for his opinions. And all the heroic and passionate grandeur of Parnell's furious career shrivelled up to mere sordidness before the inability of one narrow-minded and ignorant but vigorous woman to appreciate its quality. Not only did Edwin feel apologetic for himself, but also for Parnell. He wished he had not tried to be funny about Parnell. He wished he had not mentioned him. The brightness of the birthday was for an instant clouded. "I don't know what's coming over things," Auntie Hamps murmured sadly, staring out of the window at the street gay with October sunshine. "What with that, and what with those terrible baccarat scandals, and now there's this free education that we ratepayers have to pay for. They'll be giving the children of the working classes free meals next," she added, with remarkably intelligent anticipation. "Oh, well, never mind," Edwin soothed her. She gazed at him in loving reproach. And he felt guilty because he only went to chapel about once in 2 months, and even then from sheer moral cowardice. "Can you give me those measurements, Maggie?" Mrs Hamps asked suddenly. "I'm on my way to Brunt's." The women left the room together. Edwin walked idly to the window. After all, he had been perhaps wrong concerning the motive of her visit. The next moment he caught sight of Janet and the unaccountable nephew, breasting the hill from Bursley, hand in hand. Volume 4, Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Clayhanger by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. CHAPTER 2. Janet's Nephew. Edwin was a fairly conspicuous object at the dining-room window. As Janet and the child drew level with the corner, her eye accidentally caught Edwin's. He nodded, smiling, and took the cigarette out of his mouth and waved it. They were old friends. He was surprised to notice that Janet blushed and became self-conscious. She returned his smile awkwardly, and then, giving a gesture to signify her intention, she came in at the gate. Which action surprised Edwin still more. With all her little freedoms of manner, Janet was essentially a woman stately and correct, and time had emphasised these qualities in her. It was not in the least like her to pay informal, capricious calls at 10:15 in the morning. He went to the front door and opened it. She was persuading the child up the tiled steps. The breeze dashed gaily into the house. "Good morning. You're out early." "Good morning. Yes. We've just been down to the post office to send off a telegram. Haven't we, George?" She entered the hall, the boy following, and shook hands, meeting Edwin's gaze fairly. Her esteem for him, her confidence in him, shone in her troubled, candid eyes. She held herself proudly, mastering her curious constraint. "Now just see that!" she said, pointing to a fleck of black mud on the virgin elegance of her pale brown costume. Edwin thought anew, as he had often thought, that she was a distinguished and delightful piece of goods. He never ceased to be flattered by her regard. But with harsh masculine impartiality he would not minimise to himself the increasing cleft under her chin, nor the deterioration of her once brilliant complexion. "Well, young man," Edwin greeted the boy with that insolent familiarity which adults permit themselves to children who are perfect strangers. "I thought I'd just run in and introduce my latest nephew to you," said Janet quickly, adding, "and then that would be over." "Oh!" Edwin murmured. "Come into the drawing room, will you? Maggie's upstairs." They passed into the drawing room, where a servant in striped print was languidly caressing the glass of a bookcase with a duster. "You can leave this a bit," Edwin said curtly to the girl, who obsequiously acquiesced and fled, forgetting a brush on a chair. "Sit down, will you?" Edwin urged awkwardly. "And which particular nephew is this? I may tell you he's already raised a great deal of curiosity in the town." Janet most unusually blushed again. "Has he?" she replied. "Well, he isn't my nephew at all, really, but we pretend he is, don't we, George? It's cosier. This is Master George Cannon." "Cannon? You don't mean You remember Mrs Cannon, don't you? Hilda Lessways? Now, Georgie, come and shake hands with Mr Clayhanger." But George would not. TWO. "Indeed!" Edwin exclaimed, very feebly. He knew not whether his voice was natural or unnatural. He felt as if he had received a heavy blow with a sandbag over the heart. Not a symbolic, but a real physical blow. He might, standing innocent in the street, have been staggeringly assailed by a complete stranger of mild and harmless appearance, who had then passed tranquilly on. Dizzy astonishment held him, to the exclusion of any other sentiment. He might have gasped, foolish and tottering, "Why, what's the meaning of this? What's happened?" He looked at the child uncomprehendingly, idiotically. Little by little, it seemed an age, and was in fact a few seconds, he resumed his faculties, and remembered that in order to keep a conventional self-respect he must behave in such a manner as to cause Janet to believe that her revelation of the child's identity had in no way disturbed him. To act a friendly indifference seemed to him then to be the most important duty in life. And he knew not why. "I thought," he said in a low voice, and then he began again, "I thought you hadn't been seeing anything of her of Mrs Cannon for a long time now." The child was climbing on a chair at the window that gave on the garden, absorbed in exploration and discovery, quite ignoring the adults. Either Janet had forgotten him, or she had no hope of controlling him, and was trusting to chance that the young wild stag would do nothing too dreadful. "Well," she admitted, "we haven't." Her constraint recurred. Very evidently she had to be careful about what she said. There were reasons why, even to Edwin, she would not be frank. "I only brought him down from London yesterday." Edwin trembled as he put the question. "Is she here too Mrs Cannon?" Somehow he could only refer to Mrs Cannon as her and she. "Oh no!" said Janet, in a tone to indicate that there was no possibility of Mrs Cannon being in Bursley. He was relieved. Yes, he was glad. He felt that he could not have endured the sensation of her nearness, of her actually being in the next house. Her presence at the Orgreaves' would have made the neighbourhood, the whole town, dangerous. It would have subjected him to the risk of meeting her suddenly at any corner. Nay, he would have been forced to go in cold blood to encounter her. And he knew that he could not have borne to look at her. The constraint of such an interview would have been torture too acute. Strange that though he was absolutely innocent, though he had done naught but suffer, he should feel like a criminal, should have the criminal's shifting, downcast glance. THREE. "Auntie," cried the boy, "can't I go into this garden? There's a swing there." "Oh no!" said Janet. "This isn't our garden. We must go home. We only just called in. And big boys who won't shake hands " "Yes, yes," Edwin dreamily stopped her. "Let him go into the garden for a minute if he wants to. You can't run off like that. Come along, my lord." He saw an opportunity of speaking to her out of the child's hearing. Janet consented, perhaps divining his wish. The child turned and stared deliberately at Edwin, and then plunged forward, too eager to await guidance, towards the conquest of the garden. Standing silent and awkward in the garden porch, they watched him violently agitating the swing, a contrivance erected by a good-natured Uncle Edwin for the diversion of Clara's offspring. "How old is he?" Edwin demanded, for the sake of saying something. "About 9," said Janet. "He doesn't look it." "No, but he talks it sometimes." George did not in fact look his age. He was slight and small, and he seemed to have no bones, nothing but articulations that functioned with equal ease in all possible directions. His skin was pale and unhealthy. His eyes had an expression of fatigue, or he might have been ophthalmic. He spoke loudly, his gestures were brusque, and his life was apparently made up of a series of intense, absolute absorptions. The general effect of his personality upon Edwin was not quite agreeable, and Edwin's conclusion was that George, in addition to being spoilt, was a profound and rather irritating egoist by nature. "By the way," he murmured, "what's Mr Cannon?" "Oh!" said Janet, hesitating with emotion. "She's a widow." He felt sick. Janet might have been a doctor who had informed him that he was suffering from an unexpected disease, and that an operation severe and perilous lay in front of him. The impartial observer in him asked somewhat disdainfully why he should allow himself to be deranged in this physical manner, and he could only reply feebly and very meekly that he did not know. He felt sick. Suddenly he said to himself, making a discovery: "Of course she won't come to Bursley. She'd be ashamed to meet me." "How long?" he demanded of Janet. "It was last year, I think," said Janet, with emotion increased, her voice heavy with the load of its sympathy. When he first knew Janet, an extraordinary, quick, generous concern for others had been one of her chief characteristics. But of late years, though her deep universal kindness had not changed, she seemed to have hardened somewhat on the surface. Now he found again the earlier Janet. "You never told me." "The truth is, we didn't know," Janet said, and without giving Edwin time to put another question, she continued: "The poor thing's had a great deal of trouble, a very great deal. George's health now. The sea air doesn't suit him. And Hilda couldn't possibly leave Brighton." "Oh! She's still at Brighton?" "Yes." "Let me see. She used to be at what was it? Preston Street." Janet glanced at him with interest. "What a memory you've got! Why, it's 10 years since she was here." "Nearly," said Edwin. "It just happened to stick in my mind. You remember she came down to the shop to ask me about trains and things the day she left?" "Did she?" Janet exclaimed, raising her eyebrows. Edwin had been suspecting that possibly Hilda had given some hint to Janet as to the nature of her relations with him. He now ceased to suspect that. He grew easier. He gathered up the reins again, though in a rather limp hand. "Why is she so bound to stay in Brighton?" he inquired, with affected boldness. "She's got a boarding house." "I see. Well, it's a good thing she has a private income of her own." "That's just the point," said Janet sadly. "We very much doubt if she has any private income any longer." Edwin waited for further details, but Janet seemed to speak unwillingly. She would follow him, but she would not lead. FOUR. Behind them he could hear the stir of Mrs Hamps's departure. She and Maggie were coming down the stairs. Guessing not the dramatic arrival of Janet Orgreave and the mysterious nephew, Mrs Hamps, having peeped into the empty dining room, said, "I suppose the dear boy has gone," and forthwith went herself. Edwin smiled cruelly at the thought of what her joy would have been actually to inspect the mysterious nephew at close quarters, and to learn the strange suspicious truth that he was not a nephew after all. "Auntie!" yelled the boy across the garden. "Come along. We must go now," Janet retorted. "No. I want you to swing me. Make me swing very high." "George!" "Let him swing a bit," said Edwin. "I'll go and swing him." And calling loud to the boy, "I'll come and swing you." "He's dreadfully spoiled," Janet protested. "You'll make him worse." "I don't care," said Edwin carelessly. He seemed to understand, better than he had ever done with Clara's litter, how and why parents came to spoil their children. It was not because they feared a struggle of wills, but because of the unreasoning instinctive pleasure to be derived from the conferring of pleasure, especially when the pleasure thus confirmed might involve doubtful consequences. He had not cared for the boy, did not care for him. In theory he had the bachelor's factitious horror of a spoiled child. Nevertheless he would now support the boy against Janet. His instinct said: "He wants something. I can give it him. Let him have it. Never mind the consequences. He shall have it." He crossed the damp grass, and felt the breeze and the sun. The sky was a moving medley of Chinese white and Prussian blue, that harmonised admirably with the Indian red architecture which framed it on all sides. The high trees in the garden of the Orgreaves were turning to rich yellows and browns, and dead leaves slanted slowly down from their summits, a few reaching even the Clayhanger garden, speckling its evergreen with ochre. On the other side of the west wall traps and carts rattled and rumbled and creaked along Trafalgar Road. The child had stopped swinging, and greeted him with a most heavenly, persuasive, grateful smile. A different child! A sudden angel with delicate, distinguished gestures! A wondrous screwing up of the eyes in the sun! Weak eyes, perhaps. The thick eyebrows recalled Hilda's. Possibly he had Hilda's look. Or was that fancy? Edwin was sure that he would never have guessed George's parentage. "Now," he warned. "Hold tight!" And going behind the boy he strongly clasped his slim little waist in its blue sailor cloth, and sent the whole affair, swing seat and boy and all, flying to the skies. And the boy shrieked in the violence of his ecstasy, and his cap fell on the grass. Edwin worked hard without relaxing. "Go on! Go on!" the boy shriekingly commanded. And amid these violent efforts and brusque delicious physical contacts, Edwin was calmly penetrated and saturated by the mystic effluence that is disengaged from young children. He had seen his father dead, and had thought: "Here is the most majestic and impressive enigma that the earth can show." But the child George, aged 9 and seeming more like 7, offered an enigma surpassing in solemnity that of death. This was Hilda's. This was hers, who had left him a virgin. With a singular thrilled impassivity he imagined not bitterly the history of Hilda. She who was his by word and by kiss had given her mortal frame to the unknown Canon, yielded it. She had conceived. At some moment when he, Edwin, was alive and suffering, she had conceived. She had ceased to be a virgin. Quickly, with an astounding quickness, for was not George 9 years old, she had passed from virginity to motherhood. And he imagined all that too, all of it, clearly. And here, swinging and shrieking, exerting the power and unique charm of infancy, was the miraculous sequel. Another individuality, a new being, definitely formed, with character and volition of its own, unlike any other individuality in the universe. Something fresh, something unimaginably created. A phenomenon absolutely original of the pride and the tragedy of life. George. Yesterday she was a virgin, and to day there was this. And this might have been his, ought to have been his. Yes, he thrilled secretly amid all those pushings and joltings. The mystery obsessed him. He had no rancour against Hilda. He was incapable of rancour, except a kind of wilful, fostered rancour in trifles. Thus he never forgave the inventor of Saturday afternoon Bible classes. But rancour against Hilda? No. Her act had been above rancour, like an act of heaven. And she existed yet, on a spot of the earth's surface entitled Brighton, which he could locate upon a map. She existed. A widow, in difficulty, keeping a boarding house. She ate, slept, struggled. She brushed her hair. He could see her brushing her hair. And she was 34, was it? The wonder of the world amazed and shook him. And it appeared to him that his career was more romantic than ever. George, with dangerous abruptness, wriggled his legs downwards and slipped off the seat of the swing, not waiting for Edwin to stop it. He rolled on the grass and jumped up in haste. He had had enough. "Well, want any more?" Edwin asked, breathing hard. The child made a shy negative sigh, twisting his tousled head down into his right shoulder. After all, he was not really impudent, brazen. He could show a delicious timidity. Edwin decided that he was an enchanting child. He wanted to talk to him, but he could not think of anything natural and reasonable to say by way of opening. "You haven't told me your name, you know," he began at length. "How do I know what your name is? George, yes. But George what? George is nothing by itself. I know 10,000,000 Georges." The child smiled. "George Edwin Cannon," he replied shyly. FIve. "Now, George," came Janet's voice more firmly than before. After all, she meant in the end to be obeyed. She was learning her business as aunt to this new and difficult nephew. But learn it she would, and thoroughly. "Come on," Edwin counselled the boy. They went together to the house. Maggie had found Janet, and the two were conversing. Soon afterwards aunt and nephew departed. "How very odd!" murmured Maggie, with an unusual intonation, in the hall as Edwin was putting on his hat to return to the shop. But whether she was speaking to herself or to him, he knew not. "What?" he asked gruffly. "Well," she said, "isn't it?" She was more like Auntie Hamps, more like Clara than herself in that moment. He resented the suspicious implications of her tone. He was about to give her one of his rude, curt rejoinders, but happily he remembered in time that scarce half an hour earlier he had turned over a new leaf. So he kept silence. He walked down to the shop in a deep dream. CHAPTER 2, Volume 4. Volume 4, Chapter 3 of Clayhanger, by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. Adventure. It was when Edwin fairly reached the platform at Victoria Station and saw the grandiose express waiting its own moment to start, that the strange irrational quality of his journey first fully impressed him and frightened him. So much that he was almost ready to walk out of the station again. To come gradually into London from the north, to pass from the Manchester train, half full of Midlanders, through Bloomsbury, into the preoccupied, struggling, and untidy Strand, this gave no shock, typified nothing definite. But, having spent a night in London, deliberately to leave it for the south, where he had never been, of which he was entirely ignorant, that was like an explicit self-committal, like turning the back on the last recognisable landmark in an ill-considered voyage of pure adventure. The very character of Victoria Station and of this express was different from that of any other station and express in his experience. It was unstrenuous, soft; it had none of the busy harshness of the Midlands. It spoke of pleasure, relaxation, of spending free from all worry and humiliation of getting. Everybody who came towards this train came with an assured air of wealth and of dominion. Everybody was well dressed. Many, if not most, of the women were in furs. Some had expensive and delicate dogs. Some had pale, elegant footmen, being too august even to speak to porters. All the luggage was luxurious. Handbags could be seen that were worth 15 or 20 pounds apiece. There was no question of first, second, or third class. There was no class at all on this train. Edwin had the apologetic air of the provincial who is determined to be as good as anybody else. When he sat down in the vast interior of one of those gilded vehicles, he could not dismiss from his face the consciousness that he was an intruder, that he did not belong to that world. He was ashamed of his hand luggage, and his gesture in tipping the porter lacked carelessness. Of course he pretended a frowning, absorbed interest in a newspaper, but the very newspaper was strange. He guessed not that unless he glanced first at the penultimate column of page 1, thereof he convicted himself of not knowing his way about. He could not think consecutively, not even of his adventure. His brain was in a maze of anarchy. But at frequent intervals recurred the query, "What the devil am I up to?" And he would uneasily smile to himself. When the train rolled with all its majesty out of the station and across the Thames, he said to himself, fearful, "Well, I've done it now." TWO. On the Thursday he had told Maggie, with affected casualness, that on the Friday he might have to go to London, about a new machine. Sheer invention. Fortunately Maggie had been well drilled by her father in the manner proper to women in accepting announcements connected with business, and Edwin was just as laconic and mysterious as Darius had been about business. It was a word that ended arguments or prevented them. On the Friday he had said that he should go in the afternoon. On being asked whether he should return on the Saturday, he had replied that he did not know, but that he would telegraph. Whereupon Maggie had said that if he stayed away for the week end, she should probably have all the children up for dinner and tea. At the shop, "Stifford," he had said, "I suppose you don't happen to know a good hotel in Brighton? I might run down there for the week end if I don't come back to morrow. But you needn't say anything." "No, sir." Stifford had discreetly concurred in this suggestion. "They say there's really only one hotel in Brighton, sir, the Royal Sussex. But I've never been there." Edwin had replied, "Not the Metropole, then?" "Oh no, sir." Stifford had become a great and wonderful man, and Edwin's constant fear was that he might lose this indispensable prop to his business. For Stifford, having done a little irregular commercial travelling in Staffordshire and the neighbouring counties, had been seized of the romance of travelling. He frequented the society of real commercial travellers, and was gradually becoming a marvellous encyclopaedia of information about hotels, routes, and topography. Edwin, having been to the Bank himself instead of sending Stifford, had departed with the minimum of ostentation. He had in fact crept away. Since the visit of Janet and the child he had not seen either of them again. Nor had he mentioned the child to anybody at all. THREE. When in an astounding short space of time he stood in the King's Road at Brighton, it seemed to him that he was in a dream, that he was not really at Brighton, that town which for so many years had been to him naught but a romantic name. Had his adventurousness, his foolhardiness, indeed carried him so far? As for Brighton, it corresponded with no dream. It was vaster than any imagining of it. Edwin had only seen the pleasure cities of the poor and of the middling, such as Blackpool and Llandudno. He had not conceived what wealth would do when it organised itself for the purposes of distraction. The train had prepared him to a certain extent, but not sufficiently. He suddenly saw Brighton in its autumnal pride, Brighton beginning one of its fine week ends, and he had to admit that the number of rich and idle people in the world surpassed his provincial notions. For miles westwards and miles eastwards, against a formidable background of high yellow and brown architecture, persons, the luxuriousness of any one of whom would have drawn remarks in Bursley, walked or drove or rode in thronging multitudes. Edwin could comprehend lolling by the sea in August, but in late October it seemed unnatural, fantastic. The air was full of the trot of glossy horses, and the rattle of hits, and the roll of swift wheels, and the fall of elegant soles on endless clean pavements. It was full of the consciousness of being correct and successful. Many of the faces were monstrously ugly. Most were dissatisfied and querulous, but they were triumphant. Even the pale beings in enlarged perambulators, pulled solemnly to and fro by their aged fellow beings, were triumphant. The scarred, the maimed, yes, and the able-bodied blind, trusting to the arms of friends, were triumphant. And the enormous policemen, respectfully bland, confident in the system which had chosen them and fattened them, gave as it were to the scene an official benediction. The bricks and stucco which fronted the sea on the long embanked promenade never sank lower than a 4-storey boarding house, and were continually rising to the height of some gilt-lettered hotel, and at intervals rose sheer into the skies. 6, 8, 10 storeys, where a hotel, admittedly the grandest on any shore of ocean, sent terracotta chimneys to lose themselves amid the pearly clouds. Nearly every building was a lodgement waiting for the rich, and nearly every great bow window, out of tens of thousands of bow windows, bulging forward in an effort to miss no least glimpse of the full prospect, exhibited the apparatus and the menials of gourmandise. And the eye, following the interminable irregular horizontal lines of architecture, was foiled in the far distances, and still farther off, after a break of indistinguishable brown, it would catch again the receding run of roofs, simplified by atmosphere into featureless rectangles of grey against sapphire or rose. There were 2 piers that strode and sprawled into the sea, and these also were laden with correctness and with domination. And between the 2 men were walking miraculously on the sea to build a third, that should stride farther and deeper than the others. FOUR. Amid the crowd stamping and tapping his way monotonously along with the assured obstinacy of a mendicant, experienced and hardened, came a shabby man bearing on his breast a large label with these words: "Blind through boy throwing mortar. Discharged from 4 hospitals. incurable. Edwin's heart seemed to be constricted. He thought of the ragged snarling touts who had fawned to him at the station, and of the creatures locked in the cellars whence came beautiful odours of confectionery and soup through the pavement gratings, and of the slatternly women who kept thrusting flowers under his nose, and the half-clad infants who skimmed before the wind, yelling the names of newspapers. All was not triumph. Where triumph was, there also must be the conquered. She was there, she too, somewhere close to him. He recalled the exact tone of Janet's voice as she had said: "The poor thing's had a great deal of trouble." A widow trying to run a boarding house and not succeeding! Why, there were hundreds upon hundreds of boarding houses, all large, all imposing, all busy at the end of October. Where was hers hidden away, her pathetic little boarding house? Preston Street. He knew not where Preston Street was, and he had purposely refrained from inquiring. But he might encounter it at any moment. He was afraid to look too closely at the street signs as he passed them. Afraid. "What am I doing here?" he asked himself curiously, and sometimes pettishly. "What's my object? Where's the sense of it? I'm nothing but a damned fool. I've got no plan. I don't know what I'm going to do." It was true. He had no plan, and he did not know what he was going to do. What he did most intimately know was that the idea of her nearness made him tremble. "I'd much better go back at once," he said. He walked miles, until he came to immense and silent squares of huge palatial houses, and wide transversal avenues running far up into the land and into the dusk. In these vast avenues and across these vast squares, infrequent carriages sped like mechanical toys guided by mannikins. The sound of the sea waxed. And then he saw the twinkle of lights, and then fire ran slowly along the promenade, until the whole map of it was drawn out in flame. And he perceived that though he had walked a very long way, the high rampart of houses continued still interminably beyond him. He turned. He was tired. His face caught the full strength of the rising wind. Foam gleamed on the rising tide. In the profound violet sky to the east, stars shone and were wiped out, in fields, but to the west silver tarried. He had not seen Preston Street, and it was too dark now to decipher the signs. He was glad. He went on and on, with rapidly increasing fatigue, disgust, impatience. The thronging multitudes had almost disappeared, but many illuminated vehicles were flitting to and fro, and the shops were brilliant. He was so exhausted by the pavements that he could scarcely walk, and Brighton became for him the most sorrowful city on earth. "What am I doing here?" he asked himself savagely. However, by dint of sticking doggedly to it, he did in the end reach the hotel. FIve. After dinner and wine, both of which by their surprising and indeed unique excellence fostered the prestige of Stifford as an authority upon hotels, Edwin was conscious of new strength and cheerfulness. He left the crowded and rose-lit dining room early, because he was not at ease amid its ceremoniousness of attire and of service, and went into the turkey-carpeted hall, whose porter suddenly sprang into propitiatory life on seeing him. He produced a cigarette, and with passionate haste the porter produced a match, and by his method of holding the flame to the cigarette, deferential and yet firm, proved that his young existence had not been wasted in idleness. When the cigarette was alight, the porter surveyed his work with a pleased smile. "Another rare storm blowing up, sir," said the porter. "Yes," said Edwin. "It's been giving the window of my room a fine shake." The porter glanced at the clock. "High tide in half an hour, sir." "I think I'll go out and have a look at it," said Edwin. "Yes, sir." "By the way," Edwin added, "I suppose you haven't got a map of Brighton?" "Certainly, sir," said the porter, and with a rebirth of passion began to search among the pile of timetables and other documents on a table behind him. Edwin wished he had not asked for the map. He had not meant to ask for it. The words had said themselves. He gazed unseeing at the map for a few instants. "What particular street did you want, sir?" the porter murmured. In deciding how to answer, it seemed to Edwin that he was deciding the hazard of his life. "Preston Street." "Oh! Preston Street!" the reporter repeated in a relieved tone, as if assuring Edwin that there was nothing very esoteric about Preston Street. "It's just beyond the Metropole. You know Regency Square? Well, it's the next street after that. There's a Club on the corner." In the afternoon, then, Edwin must have walked across the end of Preston Street twice. This thought made him tremble, as at the perception of a danger past but unperceived at the moment. The porter gave his whole soul to the putting of Edwin's overcoat on Edwin's back. He offered the hat with an obeisance, and having ushered Edwin into the night, so that the illustrious guest might view the storm, he turned with a sudden new mysterious supply of zeal to other guests who were now emerging from the dining room. SIX. The hotel fronted north on an old sheltered square where no storm raged, but simultaneously with Edwin's first glimpse of the sea the wind struck him a tremendous blow, and continued to strike. He had the peculiar grim joy of the Midlander and Northerner in defying an element. All the lamps of the promenade were insecurely flickering. Grouped opposite a small jetty was a crowd of sightseers. The dim extremity of the jetty was wreathed in spray, and the waves ran along its side, making curved lines on the masonry like curved lines of a rope shaken from one end. The wet floor of the jetty shone like a mirror. Edwin approached the crowd, and peeping over black shoulders could see down into the hollow of the corner between the jetty and the sea wall, where boys on the steps dared the spent waves, amid jeering laughter. The crowd had the air of being a family intimately united. Farther on was another similar crowd near an irregular high fountain of spray that glittered in the dark. On the beach below, at vague distances, were curious rows of apparently tiny people, silhouetted like the edge of a black saw against an excessive whiteness. This whiteness was the sheet of foam that the sea made. It stretched everywhere until the eye lost it seawards. Edwin descended to the beach, adding another tooth to the saw. The tide ran absolutely white in wide chords of a circle, and then, to the raw noise of disturbed shingle, the chord vanished, and in a moment was recreated. This play went on endlessly, hypnotising the spectators, who, beaten by the wind and deafened by sound, stared and stared, safe, at the mysterious and menacing world of spray and foam and darkness. Before was the open malignant sea. Close behind, on their eminence, the hotels rose in vast cubes of yellow light, moveless, secure, strangely confident that nothing sinister could happen to them. Edwin was aware of emotion. The feel of his overcoat collar upturned against the chin was friendly to him amid that onset of the pathos of the human world. He climbed back to the promenade. Always at the bottom of his mind, the foundation of all the shifting structures in his mind, was the consciousness of his exact geographical relation to Preston Street. He walked westwards along the promenade. "Why am I doing this?" he asked himself again and again. "Why don't I go home? I must be mad to be doing this." Still his legs carried him on, past lamp post after lamp post of the wind-driven promenade, now almost deserted. And presently the high lighted windows of the grandest hotels were to be seen, cut like square holes in the sky, and then the pier which had flung a string of lanterns over the waves into the storm, and opposite the pier a dark empty space, and a rectangle of gas lamps. Regency Square. He crossed over, and passed up the Square, and out of it by a tiny side street, at hazard, and lo! he was in Preston Street. He went, hot and cold. 7. Well, and what then? Preston Street was dark and lonely. The wind charged furiously through it, panting towards the Downs. He was in Preston Street, but what could he do? She was behind the black walls of one of those houses. But what then? Could he knock at the door in the night and say, "I've come. I don't know why"? He said, "I shall walk up and down this street once, and then I shall go back to the hotel. That's the only thing to do. I've gone off my head, that's what's the matter with me. I ought to have written to her. Why in the name of God didn't I begin by writing to her? Of course I might write to her from the hotel, send the letter by messenger to night or early to morrow. Yes, that's what I'll do." He set himself to make the perambulation of the street. Many of the numbers were painted on the fanlights over the doors, and showed plain against illumination. Suddenly he saw the large figures 59. He was profoundly stirred. He had said that the matter with him was that he had gone off his head, but now, staring at that number on the opposite side of the street, he really did not know what was the matter with him. He might have been dying. The front of the house was dark, save for the fanlight. He crossed over and peered down into the area and at the black door. A brass plate, "Cannon's Boarding House," he could read. He perspired. It seemed to him that he could see her within the house, mysteriously moving at her feminine tasks. Or did she lie in bed? He had come from Bursley to London, from London to Brighton, and now he had found her portal. It existed. The adventure seemed incredible in its result. Enough for the present. He could stand no more. He walked away, meaning not to return. When he returned 5 minutes later, the fanlight was dark. Had she in the meantime come into the hall of the house and extinguished the gas? Strange that all lights should be out in a boarding establishment before 10 o'clock. He stood hesitant quite near the house, holding himself against the wind. Then the door opened a little, as it were stealthily, and a hand and arm crept out and with a cloth polished the brass of the brass plate. He thought, in his excited fancy, that it was her hand and arm. Within he seemed to distinguish a dim figure. He did not move, could not. The door opened wider, and the figure stood revealed, a woman's. Surely it was not she. She gazed at him suspiciously, duster in hand. "What are you standing there for?" she questioned inimically. "We've had enough of loiterers in this street. Please go away." She took him for a knave, expectant of some chance to maraud. She was not fearful, however. It was she. It was her voice. CHAPTER 3, Volume 4. Volume 4, Chapter 4 of Clayhanger by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4, in Preston Street. He said, "I happened to be in Brighton, so I thought I'd just call. She stared at him, frowning, in the dim diffused light of the street. "I've been seeing your little boy," he said. "I thought perhaps as I was here you'd like to know how he was getting on." "Why!" she exclaimed, with seeming bitterness. "You've grown a beard!" "Yes," he admitted foolishly, apologetically. "We can't stand here in this wind," she said, angry with the wind, which was indeed blowing her hair about, and her skirts, and her duster. She did not in words invite him to enter, but she held the door more widely open, and drew back for him to pass. He went in. She closed the door with a bang and rattle of large old fashioned latches, locks, and chains, and the storm was excluded. They were in the dark of the hall. "Wait till I put my hand on the matches," she said. Then she struck a match which revealed a common oil lamp, with a reservoir of yellow glass and a paper shade. She raised the chimney and lit the lamp, and regulated the wick. Edwin kept silence. The terrible constraint which had half paralysed him when Janet first mentioned Hilda seized him again. He stood near the woman who, without a word of explanation or regret, had jilted, outraged, and ruined him 10 years before. This was their first meeting after their kisses in his father's shop. And yet she was not on her knees, nor in tears, nor stammering an appeal for forgiveness. It was rather he who was apologetic, who sought excuses. He felt somehow like a criminal, or at least like one who commits an enormous indiscretion. The harsh curves of her hair were the same. Her thick eyebrows were the same. Her blazing glance was the same. Her intensely clear intonation was the same. But she was a profoundly changed woman. Even in his extreme perturbation he could be sure of that. As, bending under the lamp shade to arrange the wick, she exposed her features to the bright light, Edwin saw a face marred by anxiety and grief and time, the face of a mature woman with no lingering pretension to girlishness. She was 34, and she looked older than Maggie, and much older than Janet. She was embittered. Her black dress was shabby and untidy, her finger nails irregular, discoloured, and damaged. The aspect of her pained Edwin acutely. It seemed to him a poignant shame that time and sorrow and misfortune could not pass over a young girl's face and leave no mark. When he recalled what she had been, comparing the woman with the delicious wistful freshness of the girl that lived unaltered in his memory, he was obliged to clear his throat. The contrast was too pathetic to be dwelt on. Only with the woman before him did he fully appreciate the exquisite, innocent simplicity of the girl. In the day of his passion, Hilda had not seemed to him very young, very simple, very wistful. On the contrary, she had seemed to have much of the knowledge and the temper of a woman. Having at length subjugated the wick, she straightened her back, with a gesture that he knew, and for one instant she was a girl again. TWO. "Will you come this way?" she said coldly, holding the lamp in front of her and opening a door. At the same moment another door opened at the far end of the hall. There was a heavy footstep. A great hand and arm showed, and then Edwin had a glimpse of a man's head and shoulders emerging from an oblong flickering firelight. Hilda paused. "All right," she called to the man, who at once disappeared, shutting the door and leaving darkness where he had been. The large shadows cast by Hilda's lamp now had the gaunt hall to themselves again. "Don't be alarmed," she laughed harshly. "It's only the broker's man." Edwin was tongue-tied. If Hilda were joking, what answer could be made to such a pleasantry in such a situation? And if she were speaking the truth, if the bailiffs really were in possession? His life seemed to him once again astoundingly romantic. He had loved this woman, conquered her, and now she was a mere acquaintance, and he was following her stiffly into the recesses of a strange and sinister abode, peopled by mysterious men. Was this a Brighton boarding house? It resembled nothing reputable in his experience. All was incomprehensible. The room into which she led him was evidently the dining room. Not spacious, perhaps not quite so large as his own dining room. It was nearly filled by one long bare table. 8 or 10 monotonous chairs were ranged round the grey walls. In the embrasure of the window was a wicker stand with a withered plant on its summit, and at the other end of the room a walnut sideboard in the most horrible taste. The mantelpiece was draped with dark knotted and rosetted cloth. Within the fender stood a small paper screen. The walls were hung with ancient and with fairly modern engravings, some big, others little, some coloured, others in black and white, but all distressing in their fatuous ugliness. The ceiling seemed black. The whole room fulfilled pretty accurately the scornful, scrupulous housewife's notion of a lodging house interior. It was suspect. And in Edwin there was a good deal of the housewife. He was appalled. Obviously the house was small. He had known that from the outside. And the entire enterprise insignificant. This establishment was not in the King's Road, nor on the Marine Parade, nor at Hove. No doubt hundreds of such little places existed precariously in a vast town like Brighton. Widows, of course, were often in straits. And Janet had told him. Nevertheless he was appalled, and completely at a loss to reconcile Hilda with her environment. And then the broker's man! At her bidding he sat down in his overcoat, with his hat insecure on his knee, and observed under the lamp the dust on the surface of the long table. Hilda seated herself opposite, so that the lamp was between them, hiding him from her by its circle of light. He wondered what Maggie would have thought, and what Clara would have said, could they have seen him in that obscurity. THREE. "So you've seen my boy?" she began, with no softening of tone. "Yes. Janet Orgreave brought him in one morning the other day. He didn't seem to me to be so ill as all that." "Ill!" she exclaimed. "He certainly wasn't ill when he left here." But he had been. And the doctor said that this air didn't suit him. It never had suited him. It doesn't suit some folks, you know. People can say what they like. Anyhow, he's a lively piece. No mistake about that." "When he's well, he's very well," said George's mother. "But he's up and down in a minute. And on the whole he's been on the poorly side." He noticed that, though there was no relapse from the correctness of her accent, she was using just such phrases as she might have used had she never quitted her native Turnhill. He looked round the lamp at her furtively, and seemed to see in her shadowed face a particular local quality of sincerity and downrightness that appealed strongly to his admiration. Yet 10 years earlier he had considered her markedly foreign to the Five Towns. That this quality should have survived in her was a proof to him that she was a woman unique. Unique she had been, and unique she still remained. He did not know that he had long ago lost for ever the power of seeing her with a normal vision. He imagined in his simplicity, which disguised itself as chill, critical impartiality, that he was adding her up with clear-sighted shrewdness. And then she was a mother. That meant a mysterious, a mystic perfecting. For him it was as if among all women she alone had been a mother. So special was his view of the influence of motherhood upon her. He drew together all the beauty of an experience almost universal, transcendentalised it, and centred it on one being. And he was disturbed, baffled, agitated by the effect of the secret workings of his own unsuspected emotion. He was made sad and sadder. He wanted to right wrongs, to efface from hearts the memory of grief, to create bliss. And he knew that this could never be done. He now saw Hilda exclusively as a victim, whose misfortunes were innumerable. Imagine this creature with her passion for Victor Hugo, obliged by circumstances to polish a brass door plate surreptitiously at night. Imagine her solitary in the awful house with the broker's man. Imagine her forced to separate herself from her child. Imagine the succession of disasters that had soured her and transformed seriousness into harshness and acridity. And within that envelope what a soul must be burning! "And when he begins to grow he's scarcely begun to grow yet," Hilda continued about her offspring, "then he will need all his strength." "Yes, he will," Edwin concurred heartily. He wanted to ask her: "Why did you call him Edwin for his second name? Was it his father's name, or your father's, or did you insist on it yourself, because... But he could not ask. He could ask nothing. He could not even ask why she had jilted him without a word. He knew naught, and evidently she was determined to give no information. She might at any rate have explained how she had come to meet Janet, and under what circumstances Janet had taken possession of the child. All was a mystery. Her face, when he avoided the lamp, shone in the midst of a huge dark cloud of impenetrable mystery. She was too proud to reveal anything whatever. The grand pride in her forbade her even to excuse her conduct to himself. A terrific woman. FOUR. Silence fell. His constraint was excruciating. She too was nervous, tapping the table and creaking her chair. He could not speak. "Shall you be going back to Bursley soon?" she demanded. In her voice was desperation. "Oh yes," he said, thankfully eager to follow up any subject. "On Monday, I expect. I wonder if you'd mind giving Janet a little parcel from me, some things of George's. I meant to send it by post, but if you..." "Of course, with pleasure!" He seemed to implore her. "It's quite small," she said, rising and going to the sideboard, on which lay a little brown paper parcel. His eye followed her. She picked up the parcel, glanced at it, and offered it to him. "I'll take it across on Monday night," he said fervently. "Thanks." She remained standing. He got up. "No message or anything?" he suggested. "Oh!" she said coldly. "I write, you know." Well, he made the gesture of departing. There was no alternative. "We're having very rough weather, aren't we?" she said, with careless conventionality, as she took the lamp. In the hall, when she held out her hand, he wanted tremendously to squeeze it, to give her through his hand the message of sympathy which his tongue, intimidated by her manner, dared not give. But his hand also refused to obey him. The clasp was strictly ceremonious. As she was drawing the heavy latch of the door, he forced himself to say "I'm in Brighton sometimes, off and on. Now I know where you are, I must look you up." She made no answer. She merely said good night as he passed out into the street and the wind. The door banged. FIVE. Edwin took a long breath. He had seen her. Yes, but the interview had been worse than his worst expectations. He had surpassed himself in futility, in fatuous lack of enterprise. He had behaved like a schoolboy. Now, as he plunged up the street with the wind, he could devise easily a dozen ways of animating and guiding and controlling the interview so that, even if sad, its sadness might have been agreeable. The interview had been hell, ineffable torture, a perfect crime of clumsiness. It had resulted in nothing. Except, of course, that he had seen her. That fact was indisputable. He blamed himself. He cursed himself with really extraordinary savageness. "Why did I go near her?" he demanded. "Why couldn't I keep away? I've simply made myself look a blasted fool, creeping and crawling round her. After all, she did throw me over. And now she asks me to take a parcel to her confounded kid. The whole thing's ridiculous. And what's going to happen to her in that hole? I don't suppose she's got the least notion of looking after herself. Impossible, the whole thing! If anybody had told me that she'd..." Half of which talk was simple bluster. The parcel was bobbing on its loop against his side. When he reached the top of the street he discovered that he had been going up it instead of down it. "What am I thinking of?" he grumbled impatiently. However, he would not turn back. He adventured forward, climbing into latitudes whose geography was strange to him, and scarcely seeing a single fellow wanderer beneath the gas lamps. Presently, after a steep hill, he came to a churchyard, and then he redescended, and at last tumbled into a street alive with people who had emerged from a theatre, laughing, lighting cigarettes, linking arms. Their existence seemed shallow, purposeless, infantile, compared to his. He felt himself superior to them. What did they know about life? He would not change with any of them. Recognising the label on an omnibus, he followed its direction, and arrived almost immediately in the vast square which contained his hotel, and which was illuminated by the brilliant facades of several hotels. The doors of the Royal Sussex were locked because 11 o'clock had struck. He could not account for the period of nearly 3 hours which had passed since he left the hotel. The zealous porter, observing his shadow through the bars, had sprung to unfasten the door before he could ring. SIX. Within the hotel reigned gaiety, wine, and the dance. Small tables had been placed in the hall, and at these sat bald-headed men, smoking cigars and sharing champagne with ladies of every age. A white carpet had been laid in the large smoking room, and through the curtained archway that separated it from the hall, Edwin could see couples revolving in obedience to the music of a piano and a violin. One of the Royal Sussex's Saturday Cinderellas was in progress. The self-satisfied gestures of men inspecting the cigars or lifting glasses, of simpering women glancing on the sly at their jewels, and of youths pulling straight their white waistcoats as they strolled about with the air of Don Juans, invigorated his contempt for the average existence. The tinkle of the music appeared exquisitely tedious in its superficiality. He could not remain in the hall because of the incorrectness of his attire, and the staircase was blocked to a timid man by elegant couples apparently engaged in the act of flirtation. He turned through a group of attendant waiters into the passage leading to the small smoking room which adjoined the discreetly situated bar. This smoking room, like a club, warm and bright, was empty, but in passing he had caught sight of two mutually affectionate dandies drinking at the splendid mahogany of the bar. He lit a cigarette. Seated in the smoking room, he could hear their conversation. He was forced to hear it. "I'm really a very quiet man, old chap, very quiet," said one, with a wavering drawl. "But when they get at me I was at the club at 1 o'clock. I wasn't drunk, but I had a top on." "You were just gay and cheerful," the other flatteringly and soothingly suggested in an exactly similar wavering drawl. "Yes, I felt as if I wanted to go out somewhere and have another drink. So I went to Willis's Rooms. I was in evening dress. You know you have to get a domino for those things. Then of course you're a mark at once. I also got a nose. A girl snatched it off me. I told her what I thought of her, and I got another nose. Then 5 fellows tried to snatch my domino off me. Then I did get angry. I landed out with my right at the nearest chap, right on his heart. Not his face, his heart. I lowered him. He asked me afterwards, 'Was that your right?' 'Yes,' I said, 'and my left's worse.' I couldn't use my left because they were holding it. You see? You see?" "Yes," said the other impatiently and suddenly cantankerous. "I see that all right. Damned awful rot those Willis's Rooms affairs are getting, if you ask me." "Asses!" Edwin exploded within himself. "Idiots!" He could not tolerate their crassness. He had a hot prejudice against them because they were not as near the core of life as he was himself. It appeared to him that most people died without having lived. Willis's Rooms, girls, nose, heart! Asses! He surged again out of the small room, desolating the bar with one scornful glance as he went by. He braved the staircase, leaving those scenes of drivelling festivity. In his bedroom, with the wind crashing against the window, he regarded meditatively the parcel. After all, if she had meant to have nothing to do with him, she would not have charged him with the parcel. The parcel was a solid fact. The more he thought about it, the more significant a fact it seemed to him. His ears sang with the vibrating intensity of his secret existence. But from the wild confusion of his heart he could disentangle no constant idea. CHAPTER V. Volume 4. Chapter V. Of Clayhanger, by Arnold Bennett. CHAPTER V. The Bully. The next morning he was up early, preternaturally awake. When he descended, the waiters were waiting for him, and the zealous porter stood ready to offer him a Sunday paper, just as though in the night they had refreshed themselves magically without going to bed. No sign nor relic of the Cinderella remained. He breakfasted in an absent mind, and then went idly into the lounge, a room with one immense circular window giving on the Square. Rain was falling heavily. Already from the porter, and in the very mien of the waiters, he had learned that the Brighton Sunday was ruined. He left the window. On a round table in the middle of the room were ranged with religious regularity all the most esoteric examples of periodical literature in our language, from the Iron Trades Review to the Animal's Guardian. With one careless movement he destroyed the balanced perfection of a labour into which some menial had put his soul, and then dropped into a gigantic easy chair near the fire, whose thin flames were just rising through the interstices of great black lumps of coal. The housekeeper, stiff with embroidered silk, swam majestically into the lounge, bowed with a certain frigid and deferential surprise to the early guest, and proceeded to an inquiry into dust. In a moment she called sharp and low, "Arthur!" and a page ran eagerly in, to whom, in the difficult corners of upholstery and of sculptured wood, she pointed out his sins of omission, lashing him with a restrained voice that Edwin could scarcely hear. Passing her hand carelessly along the beading of a door panel, and then examining her fingers, she departed. The page fetched a duster. "I see why this hotel has such a name," said Edwin to himself. And suddenly the image of Hilda in that dark and frowsy tenement in Preston Street, on that wet Sunday morning, filled his heart with a revolt, capricious and violent. He sprang to his feet, unreflecting, wilful, and strode into the hall. "Can I have a cab?" he asked the porter. "Certainly, sir," said the porter, as if saying, "You ask me too little. Why will you not ask for a white elephant, so that I may prove my devotion?" And within 5 seconds the screech of a whistle sped through the air to the cabstand at the corner. TWO. "Why am I doing this?" he once more asked himself, when he heard the bell ring, in answer to his pull, within the house in Preston Street. The desire for a tranquil life had always been one of his strongest instincts, and of late years the instinct had been satisfied, and so strengthened. Now he seemed to be obstinately searching for tumult, and he did not know why. He trembled at the sound of movement behind the door. In a moment he thought, "I shall be right in the thick of it." As he was expecting, she opened the door herself, but only a little, with the gesture habitual to women who live alone in apprehension, and she kept her hand on the latch. "Good morning," he said curtly. "Can I speak to you?" His eye could not blaze like hers, but all his self respect depended on his valour now, and with desperation he affronted her. She opened the door wider, and he stepped in, and at once began to wipe his boots on the mat with nervous particularity. "Frightful morning!" he grinned. "Yes," she said. "Is that your cab outside?" He admitted that it was. "Perhaps if we go upstairs," she suggested. Thanking her, he followed her upwards into the gloom at the head of the narrow stairs, and then along a narrow passage. The house appeared quite as unfavourably by day as by night. It was shabby. All its tints had merged by use and by time into one tint, nondescript and unpleasant, in which yellow prospered. The drawing-room was larger than the dining-room by the poor width of the hall. It was a heaped confused mass of chairs, sofas, small tables, draperies, embroideries, and valueless knick-knacks. There was no peace in it for the eye, neither on the walls nor on the floor. The gaze was driven from one ugliness to another without rest. The fireplace was draped, the door was draped, the back of the piano was draped, and none of the dark suspicious stuffs showed a clear pattern. The faded chairs were hidden by faded antimacassars. The little futile tables concealed their rickets under vague needlework, on which were displayed in straw or tinsel frames pale portraits of dowdy people who had stood like sheep before 15th-rate photographers. The mantelpiece and the top of the piano were thickly strewn with fragments of coloured earthenware. At the windows hung heavy dark curtains from great rings that gleamed gilt near the ceiling, and lest the light which they admitted should be too powerful, it was further screened by greyish white curtains within them. The carpet was covered in most places by small rugs or bits of other carpets, and in the deep shadows beneath sofas and chairs, and behind the piano, it seemed to slip altogether out of existence into black nothingness. The room lacked ventilation, but had the appearance of having been recently dusted. THREE. Hilda closed the draped door with a mysterious, bitter, cynical smile. "Sit down," she said coldly. "Last night," Edwin began, without sitting down, "when you mentioned the broker's man, were you joking or did you mean it?" She was taken aback. "Did I say broker's man?" "Well," said Edwin, "you've not forgotten, I suppose?" She sat down with some precision of pose on the principal sofa. "Yes," she said at length. "As you're so curious. The landlords are in possession." "The bailiff's still here?" "Yes." "But what are you going to do?" "I'm expecting them to take the furniture away to morrow, or Tuesday at the latest," she replied. "And then what?" "I don't know." "But haven't you got any money?" She took a purse from her pocket and opened it with a show of impartial curiosity. 2 and 7, she said. "Any servant in the house?" "What do you think?" she replied. "Didn't you see me cleaning the door plate last night? I do like that, to look nice, at any rate." "I don't see much use in that looking nice, when you've got the bailiffs in, and no servant, and no money," Edwin said roughly, and added, still more roughly, "What should you do if anyone came inquiring for rooms?" He tried to guess her real mood, but her features would betray nothing. "I was expecting 3 old ladies, sisters, next week," she said. "I'd been hoping I could hold out till they came. They're horrid women, though they don't know it. But they've stayed a couple of months in this house every winter for I don't know how many years, and they're firmly convinced it's the best house in Brighton. They're quite enough to keep it going by themselves when they're here, but I shall have to write and tell them not to come this time." "Yes," said Edwin. "But I keep asking you, what then? And I keep saying, I don't know. You must have some plans." "I haven't." She put her lips together and dimpled her chin, and again cynically smiled. At any rate, she had not resented his inquisition. "I suppose you know you're behaving like a perfect fool," he suggested angrily. She did not wince. "And what if I am? What's that got to do with you?" she asked, as if pleasantly puzzled. "You'll starve. You can't live for ever on 2 and 7. Well? And the boy, is he going to starve?" "Oh," said Hilda, "Janet will look after him till something turns up. The fact is, that's one reason why I allowed her to take him." "Something turns up? Something turns up?" Edwin repeated deliberately, letting himself go. "You make me absolutely sick. It's absolutely incredible how some people will let things slide. What, in the name of God Almighty, do you think will turn up?" "I don't know," she said, with a certain weakness, still trying to be placidly bitter, but not now succeeding. "Where is the bailiff, Johnnie?" "He's in the kitchen with one of his friends, drinking." Edwin, with bravado, flopped his hat down forcefully on a table, pushed a chair aside, and strode towards the door. "Where are you going?" she asked in alarm, standing up. "Where do you suppose I'm going? I'm going to find out from that chap how much will settle it. If you can't show any common sense for yourself, other folks must show some for you, that's all. The brokers in the house! I never heard of such work." And indeed to a respected and successful tradesman the entrance of the bailiffs into a house did really seem to be the very depth of disaster and shame for the people of that house. Edwin could not remember that he had ever before seen a bailiff. To him a bailiff was like a bug, something heard of, something known to exist, but something not likely to enter the field of vision of an honest and circumspect man. He would deal with the bailiff. He would have a short way with the bailiff. Secure in the confidence of his bankers, he was ready to bully the innocent bailiff. He would not reflect, would not pause. He had heated himself. His steam was up, and he would not let the pressure be weakened by argumentative hesitations. His emotion was not disagreeable. When he was in the passage he heard the sound of a sob. Prudently he had not banged the door after him. He stopped and listened. Was it a sob? Then he heard another sob. He went back to the drawing-room. FOUR. Yes, she stood in the middle of the room, weeping. Save Clara, and possibly once or twice Maggie, he had never seen a woman cry, that is, in circumstances of intimacy. He had seen women crying in the street, and the spectacle usually pained him. On occasion he had very nearly made Maggie cry, and had felt exceedingly uncomfortable. But now, as he looked at the wet eyes and the shaken bosom of Hilda Cannon, he was aware of acute joy. Exquisite moment! Damn her! He could have taken her and beaten her in his sudden passion, a passion not of revenge, not of punishment. He could have made her scream with pain that his love would inflict. She tried to speak, and failed in a storm of sobs. He had left the door open. Half blind with tears, she dashed to the door and shut it, and then turned and fronted him, with her hands hovering near her face. "I can't let you do it," she murmured imploringly, plaintively, and yet with that still obstinate bitterness in her broken voice. "Then who is to do it?" he demanded, less bitterly than she had spoken, nevertheless not softly. "Who is to keep you if I don't? Have you got any other friends who'll stand by you?" "I've got the Orgreaves," she answered. "And do you think it would be better for the Orgreaves to keep you, or for me?" As she made no response, he continued: "Anybody else beside the Orgreaves?" "No," she muttered sulkily. "I'm not the sort of woman that makes a lot of friends. I expect people don't like me as a rule." "You're the sort of woman that behaves like a bloomin' infant," he said. "Supposing I don't help you, what then, I keep asking you? How shall you get money? You can only borrow it, and there's nobody but Janet, and she'd have to ask her father for it. Of course if you'd sooner borrow from Osmond Orgreave than from me." "I don't want to borrow from anyone," she protested. "Then you want to starve, and you want your boy to starve, or else to live on charity. Why don't you look facts in the face? You'll have to look them in the face sooner or later, and the sooner the better. You think you're doing a fine thing by sitting tight and bearing it, and saying nothing, and keeping it all a secret until you get pitched into the street. Let me tell you, you aren't." FIVE. She dropped into a chair by the piano, and rested her elbows on the curved lid of the piano. "You're frightfully cruel," she sobbed, hiding her face. He fidgeted away to the larger of the two windows, which was bayed, so that the room could boast a view of the sea. On the floor he noticed an open book, pages downwards. He picked it up. It was the poems of Crashaw, an author he had never read, but had always been intending to read. Outside, the driver of his cab was bunching up his head and shoulders together under a large umbrella, upon which the rain spattered. The flanks of the resigned horse glistened with rain. "You needn't talk about cruelty," he remarked, staring hard at the signboard of an optician opposite. He could hear the faint clanging of the church bells. After a pause she said, as if apologetically Keeping a boarding house isn't my line. But what could I do? My sister-in-law had it, and I was with her. And when she died... Besides, I dare say I can keep a boarding house as well as plenty of other people. But... well, it's no use going into that." Edwin abruptly sat down near her. "Come now," he said, less harshly, more persuasively. "How much do you owe?" "Oh!" she cried, pouting and shifting her feet. "It's out of the question. They've distrained for £75." "I don't care if they're distrained for £775." She seemed just like a girl to him again now, in spite of her face and her figure. "If that was cleared off, you could carry on, couldn't you? This is just the season. Could you get a servant in time for these 3 sisters?" "I could get a charwoman, anyhow," she said unwillingly. "Well, do you owe anything else?" "There'll be the expenses of the distraint." "Yes." "That's nothing. I shall lend you £100. It just happens that I've got £50 on me in notes. That and a cheque'll settle the bailiff person, and the rest of the 100 I'll send you by post. It'll be a bit of working capital." She rose and threaded between chairs and tables to the sofa, several feet from Edwin. With a vanquished and weary sigh she threw herself on to the sofa. "I never knew there was anybody like you in the world," she breathed, flicking away some fluff from her breast. She seemed to be regarding him not as a benefactor, but as a natural curiosity. He looked at her like a conqueror. He had taught her a thing or two. He had been a man. He was proud of himself. He was proud of all sorts of details in his conduct. The £50 in notes, for example, was not an accident. Since the death of his father he had formed the habit of never leaving his base of supplies without a provision far in excess of what he was likely to need. He was extravagant in nothing, but the humiliations of his penurious youth and early manhood had implanted in him a morbid fear of being short of money. He had fantastically surmised circumstances in which he might need a considerable sum at Brighton. And lo! the sequel had transformed his morbidity into prudence. "This time yesterday," he reflected in his triumph, "I hadn't even seen her, and didn't know where she was. Last night I was a fool. Half an hour ago she herself hadn't a notion that I was going to get the upper hand of her. Why, it isn't 2 days yet since I left home, and look where I am now!" With pity and with joy he watched her slowly wiping her eyes. 34, perhaps yet a child compared to him. But if she did not give a natural ingenuous smile of relief, it was because she could not. If she acted foolishly, it was because of her tremendous haughtiness. However, he had lowered that. He had shown her her master. He felt that she had been profoundly wronged by destiny, and that gentleness must be lavished upon her. In a casual tone he began to talk about the most rapid means of getting rid of the bailiff. He could not tolerate the incubus of the bailiff a moment longer than was absolutely unavoidable. At intervals a misgiving shot like a thin flying needle through the solid satisfaction of his sensations. "She's a strange and an incalculable woman. Why am I doing this?" Shot, and was gone, almost before perceived. CHAPTER 5, Volume 4.